Hi everyone, this is Sia D. Clayton, Head of Content here at Goodlord. Today's podcast is a recording of our webinar, Taking Advantage of the Renters Reform Bill, How Savvy Agents Can Get Ahead in 2024. The Renters Reform Bill gives a number of new unique opportunities for agents to get ahead. You'll hear from Laura Tweedy, barrister at Gatehouse Chambers, and Sean Hooker, Head of Redress at the Property Redress Scheme. Ollie Sherlock, our Managing Director of Insurance at Goodlord, will guide the discussion. So, without further ado, on with the podcast.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this instalment of the Goodlord webinar series. The Renters Reform Bill series started many moons ago, and it's carrying on, and hopefully continues to be as insightful as possible. And I'm sure today's will be, as I'm joined by two fantastic guests. My name is Ollie Sherlock. I'm Managing Director of Insurance here at Goodlord. And today I'm joined by Laura Tweedy, who's a barrister at Gatehouse Chambers, and Sean Hooker, who's Head of Redress at the Property Redress Scheme. I'm going to start with you, Laura. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. I am very well. It's a beautiful day.
It is indeed.
Outside my window, so feeling very good. Looking forward to chatting to you all about this.
Yes, thank you so much for bringing your expertise to the webinar. And you're somebody who's followed the webinar now, or this series, for some time, right? I think you reached out and sort of said, hey, could I help out? And we're absolutely grateful for you attending. So you've kind of been the other side of this on a few times, I gather.
Yes, I've sort of been dealing with renters reform and the legal side of things since, before the white paper even was brought out, and training lots of solicitors and clients in relation to what might happen. And I was really enjoying the Goodlord approach to this. I think you've got it right. And so I'm really thrilled to be part of it now. Yeah, I was like, let me come and play.
Well, thank you for coming. And just very briefly explain what your day job is then, Laura.
I'm a property barrister, so I've been a barrister for about 17 years, and I go to court, I write opinions, I sort of deal predominantly with landlords and advise on landlord and tenant issues. So whether that's sort of policy advice, what should we do, or when it's all gone very, very wrong, when you don't want to see me, I try and sort it all out. I'm also a mediator, so I do approach things from a litigation perspective, but personally, I'm very focused on resolution as opposed to dispute.
And indeed, like any kind of challenge, the more work you put in the front end normally helps alleviate any stress in the back end. And that's what we're trying to do here, right? We're hoping that actually all of our attendees never have to see your face properly in that context, because hopefully they can do things right and they can provide fantastic service. But on a more positive note, thank you for joining. We're also joined by Sean Hooker. Now, Sean, you've been a mainstay on some of these webinars, but for the people who haven't joined before, can you just sort of go through what your sort of day job looks like, please?
Yeah, good morning, Ollie. Good morning, Laura, as well, and everybody. Right, I deal with complaints. So I am Head of Redress at the Property Redress Scheme, and we deal with complaints of customers of letting agents, estate agents, property managers. Basically, I try to bring people together, resolve, and make sure that that complaints are handled in the correct way. So very similar to what Laura does, but we are done as a government approved scheme. So you have to be a member of it. And if I make a decision, unfortunately, election agents, you have to abide by my decision. If you can't come to a mutually agreed settlement, I impose one on you. So I have a carrot and a stick, basically. Carrot for the hair and stick. Very, very rarely do I use a stick.
And talking of the hair, Sean, I noted earlier you've had a fantastic new haircut, looking brilliant. So all ready for the Christmas festive period, I'm sure, but looking sparkling as usual.
I'm really looking forward to this webinar, because I think this is the one time I'm going to speak less, because I'm really interested to hear from Laura's perspective on the legal side. So I think it's going to be really interesting.
I'm not taking any bets on that, Sean. I know you too well. But indeed, you're here. I'm here, and as is everyone else, here to both hear your and Laura's views on what we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about taking advantage of the reform bill and how agents can get ahead in 2024. I would argue that any change is opportunity. And within that, sometimes it's hard to see the opportunity. And I definitely think within this change, it's been hard because of the time in which has amassed since we kind of understood what this thing was going to be, what it potentially could be, and to where we are now. now. We're going to go through where we are now and then sort of form hopefully an opinion of what the opportunity is moving forwards, and talking about how the landscape is changing over the next hour. The Q&A is switched on from the very start, as always, for all attendees. So please do throw any questions you may have regarding the Renters Reform Bill or any aspect of it. You can add that into the Q&A chat, and we'll try and go through as many questions as we possibly can as we go through the slides. We also have a segment later as well. We've got Stephanie from a Goodlord perspective running the slides. Thank you, Stephanie. If we have any technical problems, please bear with us. We'll jump straight back on. I'm calling in from Lincolnshire, which has just got electricity. So on the basis of that, if my Wi-Fi drops like it did in our practice session, I will jump straight back on. So apologies in advance if that happens, but touch wood, we've had pretty good form so far in these sessions of it not happening. So hopefully we'll be absolutely dandy, and you'll be able to hear us throughout. If at any stage you can't hear us, or indeed the sound's muffled, again, please just point it out to us. You're normally really good as attendees to tell us something's not quite right, and we'll try and fix it straight away. But let's look forward. And if you go to the next slide, please. Let's look forward to what we're going to be talking about today, and also just giving you a reminder of where Goodlord sits within this aspect. We take industry legislative challenge really seriously. We believe that we can be part of the solution and part of an education process. And indeed, you may have seen our latest State of the Lettings Industry report. This is something we compile on an annual basis that takes views from across the industry, from all stakeholders, and puts them into one report for you as letting agents and professionals. I would urge you, if you haven't, to download this and use it with some of your customers. We've had great examples of letting agents using the data here to be forward-facing in front of especially landlords to help educate them. And indeed, that's part of the job, isn't it? On educating landlords on what's going on and why it's happening. Hopefully, you've got a resource there that is helpful. The last real note of what Goodlord is, if you don't want to ever speak to Laura or Sean, I may suggest you might want to use the Goodlord platform, because Goodlord keeps you compliant. It allows you to manage the pre-tenancy process efficiently, swiftly, and allows you to focus on things that are growing your business. So Goodlord takes care of everything from a landlord's terms of business all the way through to the tenancy signing, the holding deposit being collected, the first month's rent being collected, rent collection thereafter, rent protection insurance, and everything in between. If you want to understand more about what Goodlord can do for your business, please visit our website at www.goodlord.co, where you can book a demo, and we'll gladly take you through how Goodlord could be a positive effect and a process for your business. Like with all these sessions, it's not about Goodlord. It's not about what we sell and what we do. It's really here to discuss what's going on in the industry. And with that in mind, we're going to cover 4 different segments today. We're going to talk about what stage the bill is currently in. We're now at arguably the business end of this process, which feels like it's lasted for years and years and years, because it has lasted for years and years and years. So we're going to talk about where we are at the moment. We're going to look at some of the current industry sentiment that we've garnered as part of the State of the Industry report. We're going to also discuss what's next politically. The political landscape in this country, especially when it comes to housing, really shapes our destiny, I would argue. How many homes we build, the view we take on landlords and tenants, and how we support those two different parties, frankly, all comes from the political sphere. So we're going to discuss exactly what that looks like and what we think it looks like going into 2024. And then we're going to turn our attentions onto you as letting agents and discuss how agents can take advantage of such an uncertain market going into the next year, with the Renters Reform Bill looming over us. As I said, the Q&A is open from the word dot, but we will have time, hopefully, at the end in order to cover any questions. And I see there's a question in already, which I'll come to shortly. Somebody who hasn't left their name, so please do give your name, really, just so I can say good morning to you. But without further ado, let's have a look at where we are and where the bill currently is. Laura, I'm going to come to you first. Can you just give us an update as to where we are in this process? Because it has been quite a long process to this stage. So can you just inform us of what's happened and where are we?
Absolutely. So back in 2019, early 2019, Theresa May mentioned abolishing Section 21. And we had a white paper from the government on what that was going to look like in June 22. And then we got the actual bill in May 2023. So since that's what we're working, that's the meat of what we're looking at. And then that sort of has a very long political process. It had its second reading on the 8th of November this year, which was great to get things moving. And we're actually now, from the 14th of November, in the committee stage. So the committee stage is sort of another process. They take information, they discuss the bill. And when will this become when are we looking at moving this forward? I'll sort of we can address when we get to that. But at the moment, it's still being debated by MPs and shadow MPs. And even today, from 9:25, they're looking at it again today. So as we debate it, so are they.
Indeed. And we were looking at the amendment papers, and actually, to your point, it's a live running document. It's quite interesting. You can actually view this on the government website, and you can see all the proposed amendments from all different parties and different individuals. And it really sort of shines a light on how much work is going in behind the scenes. We may sit here thinking, God, they're sat on their hands a little bit here, but actually at this stage you can see what different parties are suggesting and those amendments. One amendment in particular, and one point in particular, has continued to be the breaking news story, I suppose, and that's around Section 21. Section 21. For all love and money was guaranteed to be abolished. I think, Sean, you've been on previous webinars with other industry leaders as well. And the only thing that was certain above death and taxes was that Section 21 was going to be abolished. But Sean, that isn't as clear as it once was, is it? Because the government have come out and said, actually, there's potentially a hurdle here. Do you want to talk us through, from your perspective, what's happened to Section 21 in particular? Well,
absolutely. It's double talk. That's to be fair, in my personal opinion, and it's very interesting because I'm going to name drop a bit now. I was with a meeting with an eminent professor called Professor Hodges yesterday, and along with head of the tribunal, Judge McGrath, and we were talking about this with other people from the sector, the housing ombudsman and the TPO, and it was basically that court reform has now been thrown into the mix. What's happened is that we know that since COVID and the courts have resumed that getting any sort of possession order through the courts is a nightmare at the moment. So my good colleague Paul Champolina, for example, we run Landlord Action. We've never been busier, as he says, which he's got a big smile on his face on that. Well, because it means that we're busy and lawyers are busy, but what you're getting stagnation, and you're getting things not getting done. So what the government has now pledged is, before they introduce Section 21, because the abolition of Section 21, because this is going to mean more cases going through court, you've got to have a court system that is fit and proper to deal with them. But in my view, it's a lot of talk, because we've been talking about court reform for years and years and years. We've been talking about digitalisation of the court systems for years and years and years, and it hasn't happened. So politically, I think this is a carrot been given to the industry to say, well, actually, don't panic. We're not going to do this until the courts are fit and ready. But in my personal view, and Laura, you deal with this every single day, I don't think it's going to happen very soon. But I think politically, they're going to have to get Section 21 on the statute books, and it's going to be implemented, if not by this government, by the next government.
Indeed, and we'll come on to a bit later, sort of where does that sit between the two different parties, depending who's in power. But Laura, the Section 21 and the court reform piece, can you give us any insights as to why the courts need reforming? To Sean's point, it may or may not happen, and there's been debate, which we'll come to in a minute, around whether this is a U-turn or not. But in your capacity, can you give us an insight as to why court reform is something that is necessary, almost away from the Section 21 piece? Why are the courts not fit for purpose, arguably, at the moment?
Too slow. In my view, it's as simple as that. It's too slow. Even on Section 21, it's still too slow. It takes often a year to get a possession order on what should be, in my view, a slam dunk case. It's just the process is too slow. As to what Sean was saying about these court reforms have been talked about for a long time. There's been many debates and decisions made on having a separate housing court. And the government have been clear there is going to be no separate housing court. But in relation to what court reforms are going to happen, it seems to me that this is potentially just something political. We don't have any detail, and it's interesting because the committees, I've been reading through the 180 pages of the committee recently, and one of the points made is, but the government haven't said anything about what these court reforms might be. How can we benchmark and measure success in relation to these court reforms going through? And I think that's absolutely pivotal. in my personal view, it's not going to be major overhaul of the court system. For example, in the recent October 23 government response in relation to renters reform, the government are saying, right, what we're going to do is we're already recruiting for new bailiffs, because that's one of the problems. You can't, once you've even got the possession order, you then have a massive delay in getting it executed, getting it actually to take effect. And so I don't think the government are going to say, oh, no section, we can't go through with Section 21 because we've got to overhaul the court system. I think it's just a sort of a little stumbling block in place. No Section 21's happening. I'm really convinced that we're going to end up in a position with no Section 21 notices. And it may be the court reform is as simple as we're going to get new bailiffs and we're going to implement a new system for how a court allocates a case. So yeah, I don't think it's as scary as people are thinking it is, or as good for a landlord as people are thinking it is.
And Mark on the Q&A makes a good point. Good morning, Mark. It says, thankfully, as a practitioner in the Southwest, a Section 21 usually goes through court in 2 to 3 months, but do agree rent arrears, etc., can take over a year to go through court. Bailiff delay around 4 weeks. And these kind of stresses have real life impact on landlords, especially. In my personal view, that level of demonization of landlords, when coupled with these kind of stresses, is absolutely unhelpful in supplying property to the very people that need it, which are tenants. And let's remind ourselves, the point of the bill was to make a fairer PRS, a more balanced PRS. So actually, having things that act as blockers is wholly unhelpful, which is, we discussed on a previous webinar whether this was a U-turn or not. And I would argue that actually, in isolation, to both Laura and Sean's point, court reform is absolutely necessary. Absolutely necessary, because actually these processes have a real life impact and, to Laura's point, take far too long. However, we've known that this has been the case for many, 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 many years. And then to pull this out at the 11th hour as a reason why we can't then go forward on the suggested change seems to me somewhat strange. And if I was a cynic, I would argue that we're kicking the can down the road here and making it somebody else's problem. Which again will come on to the political fortunes and insights in a bit. But this really does mean that it puts a question mark over whether this reform bill for me is actually going to be introduced under this government. I note that this week, Sean, Mr. Gove has come out and assured everybody that from a leaseholder perspective, those changes are going to be brought in. We're yet to hear similar guarantees around the renters reform bill. I'm not saying they won't come, but I think it puts a question mark over whether this is deliverable between now and what an election maybe next October. Now, if you look at the amendments, how many pages was that document? Did you say, Laura, 150, 180 odd? The amendment papers,
and that was just over the last couple of weeks.
There's a lot to discuss here with quite little time in relative terms. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this moves through. I suppose the point should be noted, this does have cross-party support, and we'll come on to shortly some of the sort of sound bites that Labour have given if they were to get into power, and some of the assurances they've made around what will happen when it comes to this. Best guess time then, before we move on. Sean, when do you think the Renters Reform Bill will become law?
Right, so becoming law, I mean, they're putting their foot down on the accelerator on this one. I mean, you've got to remember, something like COVID, the COVID Act went through in 3 days. Parliament doesn't work that quickly, ever. But they're put their foot down on the accelerator here. So they will finish the committee process, because they've got, as I say, Laura said today, they're sitting today, they're sitting on Thursday, they're probably sitting a couple of days next week. By the 5th, it then has to go over to the House of Lords. They will go through a very similar process to what's happened in the House of Commons. There'll be something called ping pong when the act goes between the two houses, and they'll get it through. I think it'll be on the statute books by April, okay? But even before all of this political shenanigans, there was already going to be a large implementation period built into the act. So it was always going to be that when Section 21 was abolished, there was going to be an interim period. So it would start for new tenancies before it would start for existing ones. And that would take a period of time to roll through, which would take us beyond October without a shadow of a doubt. So it will, the main impact of this will land after October. The same with the implementation of a portal or an ombudsman, because they are going to need to procure the services of that. They haven't even decided. I was on this meeting yesterday with all the bodies that may have an interest in this, and they all said they've heard nothing. They don't know what's going on. It's all up in the air. So the implementation period will definitely. This is a hiatus. 2024 will be a hiatus. 2025 will be when you will see the impact of this. I'll say one last thing, because it's very important, because we want to be looking to plan forward. We won't want people to panic and to think that this is all going to happen tomorrow, or even when the bill passes in April. If it goes through in April, which I think it will do, it's going to have an implementation period. We've got to be looking at things that are more immediate as well. So, for example, breaking news will be in the next day, if not today. National Trading Standards are going to announce their material information, Part B and Part C, and issue guidance. That's going to be more for agents to be concentrating on now than looking down the line, maybe 18 months' time, to when the full impact of this bill will come into place.
And that, for me, is where the cynicism may have some basis of truth, because what you're saying there is, this thing will come in, but the detail of this thing won't be implemented for a long time thereafter. And actually, if you look at other elements of the bill, things like decent homes, for example, which was the major reason, one of the major reasons why this thing was taken off the ground, there was no detail. This is we're going to have the power to do this later, and we'll let you know what it looks like. So I fear that in the lack of that detail, it's open to change, which may be a benefit, may not. But we're certainly not getting a fully formed bill that gives absolute clarity across the major points that it intended to do at the very start. And that's something that I think for professionals, it means that they're going to have to keep watching this space, right, Laura? They're going to have to keep up to date with what changes are being introduced and when, and understanding the difference between something being passed and something being implemented, because there's going to be a bit of a waiting period for the sounds of it. How do you think, Laura, that affects landlords in terms of sentiment and confidence?
So in relation to what Sean just spoke to, I'm inclined to agree, actually. I think there is momentum getting behind it now. And I think we're going to hopefully get royal assent at some point next year. Or if the government sort of have a political shift, they'll put it off till after the election. We just can't predict that. But let's assume for a moment that it happens before the election. And once it's received royal assent, there's a period of 6 months before new tenancies are going to be required to be different, and then a period of 12 months for old tenancies to sort of convert over. So it's not like immediate, we get the act and then changes are in place. We do have time. As to what we're seeing at the moment from the committee stage, it's interesting that what the sort of landlords' points of view have been taken into account. We have had the sort of take evidence from important people in the sector, and that has happened. And so the sort of landlords are feeding in as to this. In terms of, do you want me to sort of deal with now what things we've seen are being proposed?
Please, yeah.
I found it quite interesting reading. It's important, I think, just to note this 20th of October 23 government response, because that was the document that said, we need these court reforms. I read that document. I don't think it was as sort of stark as the media have made it out to be. But what it also said was there's going to be a student ground for possession. This is major. This is sort of the headline to me. There's been so much lobbying about students. The student market didn't work under the current, the proposed bill. And so finally the government have backtracked and they've said, okay, there's going to be a student ground for possession. So that's super interesting. And super interesting if you're a lawyer, perhaps. And then the government's also saying it's going to legislate about what the judge considers reasonable when looking at the grounds for possession. And if I just pause there for a moment, this doesn't, just because we lose Section 21, it doesn't mean we lose the ability as a landlord to take possession. We have already Section 8. We will continue to have Section 8, and Section 8 will be developed and expanded to give new grounds for possession. For example, something we don't have at all now is this sort of ground 8A. If a tenant goes into arrears of 3 times, essentially, for a day, 2 months arrears, three times over a period of 3 years, mandatory possession order. So it's not sort of all lost for landlords just because you lose Section 21. And yeah, it's interesting that the court's even saying when we're looking at grounds which the judge is to consider, is it reasonable here for me to give this landlord a possession order, or shall I let the tenant stay? The government are saying they're going to legislate on what that will be. So we already have a move forward. And then recently, I found it interesting to look at what the Labour shadow minister is saying. And when I'm looking down, I'm just reminding myself of my notes. And he's asking for a load of things. And just to caveat this isn't what the government are saying is going to happen, but it might give sort of a flavour of what the sort of political mind is in Labour. For example, they've said when using one of the grounds under 8, that schedule Section 8 that I've just said about, using sale or occupation. So when a landlord's proposing to sell or proposing to occupy by his family members, they want evidence provided within 16 weeks of what that will be, because at the moment it's quite an open ground to landlords as to what actually happens on the ground after. So I thought that was interesting. He was also suggesting that certain grounds move to 4 months notice to be given by the landlord, not 2. He wanted this ground 8A that I mentioned to be discretionary, not mandatory. And the last point I wanted to make is he also was suggesting fines. We've talked about implementation and enforcement of this will be through fines to the landlord from the local authority, essentially. And there's 5,000 or 30,000, depending on the seriousness. He wants to increase them to 30,000 and 60,000. And that faced strong opposition from the government, who's saying that they think the 5 and the 30 are the right level. So very much a work in progress. But this is where we're moving through at the moment, and landlords' views have been considered by the government.
And you can see with that sort of range of potential change and challenge why some landlords would be less than optimistic when it comes to this bill, because I think, like most industries, landlords like certainty. They want to know where they're standing. And there's been a lot made of landlords exiting the market, a mass exodus. I don't quite buy that rhetoric. I do believe landlords are leaving the market. Whether it's a mass exodus or not, and whether we're net down on amount of PRS properties, I think remains to be seen. And I'm not sure that rhetoric is overly helpful for the overall market and the industry itself, because, panic creates panic. And, we have a role to play, I think, as letting agents and professionals to educate, to your point, that these changes are not absolutely limiting your ability to get a property back, for example, which has been the major theme around Section 21 in some landlord forums. But it is clear from our data that landlords are pessimistic, as are letting agents around this. Now, this is shifting. The letting agent wise, especially, agents are becoming a bit more optimistic than not around the changes, because I think we're understanding more and more. But this really sort of highlights the fact that, a level of uncertainty, and this continues to drag on, especially if we get a bill that is detail light. And that's possible in numerous areas. I think there's going to have to be absolute surety around Section 21 replacement to your Section 8 point. But things like I said, noted earlier, decent home standard coming down the tracks, for example, there won't be certainty, I don't think, in the next year or two on that and what that means. It will be introduced at a later stage. And the government essentially, through this bill, will have the power to do so. They're noting that in the bill itself. But, sentiment is important because, the industry is built on confidence. And hopefully what we can do as professionals and letting agents is educate landlords to the points that you're making there, Laura, that these are going to be your options. This is what the future could look like. But at the end of the day, I'm a big believer that good landlords like good tenants, and good tenants like good landlords. And there is a market here. And arguably a market that's growing from a rental value perspective, because supply is below where it needs to be. And we are seeing landlords take advantage of that. Now, I suppose, Sean, if you're a highly leveraged landlord that has gone and got 5 or 6 properties, and you've got you're indebted to those 5 or 6 properties up to the hilt, then life is going to be difficult because you've got wider economic effects. But there are going to be serious steps that landlords have to go through in order to comply with this. And one of those is highlighted by Eric. Good morning, Eric. I hope you're well. He says landlords will need to register for membership of a redress scheme for each legal entity in which a property is owned. This will run into millions. How long will this take, and could a redress scheme cope? I think you're very well placed, Sean, to maybe answer that question out of the three of us.
Right. Well, Eric's right, because what the government proposed as their register, and let's not beat around the bush, this is a form of National Landlord Register for England, is that it's going to be property driven. So each of the properties will be registered. So if it's property driven, then your house doesn't move, your flat doesn't move. But what does move is who is responsible, who is legally responsible. So we already had the dilemma of what happens if you are using an agent. Where does that kick in with what we do as an agent redress and what they're proposing to do for landlord redress? But equally, now the issue is what happens if you have multiple trusts and multiple companies and other things there? How is this data going to be A, recorded, B, monitored? What's going to be the implications on that? So the answer to that is I don't know, because I like simple solutions. So I think if we drive it by the property, that's the fixed entity that you can fix it on. But you're still going to have to find out who is going to be accountable. And bless Laura, this is where you are going to get a lot of the legal challenges. We've already had the reclusion case there on rent to rent, which is that they're looking to undo as part of the reform. Reclusion is the one where the superior landlord, the person that owns the property, wasn't the person who the tenants were letting the property from. That was a rent-to-rent agent who was in between. The law now says that the person who owns the property is not as culpable for things like landlord licensing as the person who is actually the intermediate landlord. There's been a lot of information on Goodlord on that if you want to go and find out. There's a lot of reading on that. They're looking to try and undo that. That's going to be quite messy. So I think, Eric, I'm on my optimistic side. If we make this as simple as possible, drive it by the property, we might not have to have all of this. But you're absolutely right. Any redress scheme or any portal that's going to be set up, it's going to take a long time for this to be populated and compliance to come in. They found it in Scotland. They found it with Rent Smart Wales. So again, this is another light the touch paper and stand back until the fuse is burnt down, and then it might all go bang.
I like the portal, because from your legal side of things, it puts everything in one place. It puts everything that you're supposed to be doing there. There's going to be, tick boxes to say this, that, and the other. And it sort of creates, we've been talking about uncertainty. This, for me, creates more certainty. The good landlords that are able to do this correctly will be safer, because all of the information will be there. They're not going to be able to be challenged as easily.
I agree in principle. And if I was playing devil's advocate to Sean's point, which I think is accurate, like, hey, these things coming, it's going to take some time. It's not going to take some time. It's going to take some investment. It's going to take expertise, and it's going to take stakeholder management to get both the redress scheme and the portal off the ground. And to the best of my knowledge, Sean, these are still frameworks on a sheet somewhere. There isn't anything meaningful in terms of progress done here. So it kind of bolsters the point of, from a timeline perspective, we could be some way off actually seeing these things enacted. And the idea that we know something's coming, but we don't quite know when, again, just promotes a level of uncertainty that I think is somewhat helpful. And I suppose the other point, to your point there, Laura, is I agree, that level of that framework of having a portal that keeps everything in one place, I think over time turns into something like a property logbook, actually, that you can add to, that has a historic nature to it. That means people have got transparency. That's fantastic. The slight problem I have is that with all of this, ever since the white paper, and if you control F on the white paper all the way through to the bill, I think you'll struggle to find the term letting agent in any of the documents. And that for me is a problem, because you've got around 45 to 50% of the PRS that is supported by letting agent professionals. And I highlight the word professional. And I think that gives a benefit to both tenants and landlord. But also, it's not clear in terms of the role letting agents can play when interacting with these kind of steps. So what it looks like is that letting agents will have to follow one process to make sure that they are compliant. Landlords will have to follow another process themselves to make sure that they are compliant. I just would really appreciate, I think the market would, and understanding that letting agents play a crucial role in understanding what steps they could carry out on behalf of landlords, because that's why they exist. And actually what this needs is almost a two-level education system that means landlords know exactly what they need to do, letting agents know exactly what they need to do, and the two do cross over. So I'm going to be interested to see what sort of powers or not letting agents, when managing a property, hold. I suspect from the omission of their title alone, there's going to be very little, which I think is a shame, because I think there's a way to centralise around professionalism, especially when we look forward at the potential of regulation for letting agents. Not very many markets would ignore professionals. Imagine if the financial market turned around and said, we're just going to ignore the professional part of this. We're going to let people do exactly what they want, but we're going to regulate them all individually. It seems to be a long way around a problem that you've got, 12,000+ professionals out there that could really help with this. Instead, they're being slightly sidelined. And I appreciate I could be attacked because, hey, we have a commercial interest in that. It's how I feel. I've been a letting agent myself. I think they play a crucial role. And I think tenants have a better experience when they're renting through a letting agent. We've had focus groups commit that. So I think, blending in the role of letting agent here to these challenges and understanding that there's different objectives here is potentially really confusing for both landlords and letting agents. Mark says, the landlord portal, the devil is in the detail and at whose cost. Government and IT have a very poor track record. This, of course, Mark, is your opinion. I couldn't possibly comment. What I would say, though, is that if it follows the new passport process, which when we spoke with DLUC, they were looking at that framework, that actually is more robust than anything else I've seen the government promote. And I would expect something like a DVLA integration here. But the absolute vital point of a portal for me is integration. It has to be open to integrations to allow this to be succinct and really allow it to deliver the absolute benefit that I believe it can do in terms of Laura's point. I'm not going to touch back on Section 21. We've talked about that, and whether you believe it's a U-turn or not, or whether there's a level of cynicism there that we're using this well-known challenge to kick the can down the road, I'll leave that to personal opinion. One of the things that I did in preparation for this webinar, I've done previously as well, is go back to some of the statements that were made when this kind of process was suggested. And we've got to remember, Sean and Laura, this was a manifesto pledge. It's quite rare that government sits on a manifesto pledge for as long when it has cross-party support and everyone thinks it's a good idea. I would suggest it's because it's quite complicated, along with they've had other priorities, in all fairness. But one of the initial parts of the or objectives of the bill was to introduce a decent home standard. Laura, where are we on decent homes?
It's not part of it. It's not part of this bill. And the government are mentioning that they want to introduce decent home standards, but in my view, that's quite a big thing to do. It's quite a major change, and I don't anticipate that happening anytime soon. It may be that they put something in that allows them to bring it in through regulation, which would be quite dangerous in my view. But that also just takes me back to just a couple of points on what you were just saying, Ollie. I had three sort of points that hopefully will be able to assist. These things that we don't have detail on, and Mark's right, the devil's in the detail. And at the moment, I think those are going to be brought through in regulation. So, we were talking about the timeframes when this will happen. These are going to be things that happen even later, because the detail isn't included. The government will bring them in the years that follow, months, I don't know, that follow by regulation. And there was 2 points as to the agents that I just wanted to touch upon. One is absolutely, where's the reference to agents? But agents can play a really pivotal role here. They can be the ones who say to the landlords, look at me, I'm a great agent and I'm going to help you to put all of this information into the portal and I'll take all this responsibility. Educating agents as you do, Ollie, is key here. And, the people that are on this call are clearly interested and engaged in the good landlords, the good agents who want to do this right. And so they've got a key role to play, and the sort of opportunity there as to what they can take off the hands of landlords. And you mentioned about what good agents want good tenants. I would say absolutely. And from my legal perspective, the sort of what I see it when it all goes wrong, right? That's normally when landlords are managing it by themselves. It's not to say that all agents are great. They're not. I've had cases where the agents have just made huge errors, which has totally messed it up for the landlords. And then you look at sort of actions against the agent separately. But mostly, if it's gone really bad, it's normally the landlord trying to do it themselves.
And that's because this is complicated. Renting and managing a property is a serious job. And it's one of the reasons why I am supportive of regulation. I think when you're handling such a serious job, there should be a level of regulation that allows you to, one, make sure that all of your staff and you have a framework in which you can recognise you're of a certain standard. That's important. That protects professionals, I think, away from unscrupulous people who set up an agency tomorrow then disappear the next day. But also, this is hard. And, my view is that we should be working on that 45 to 50% and increasing the amount of landlords that understand the value of an agent. And with that value, hopefully comes more value in itself, i.e. the agents can dictate a higher fee for their services, because for too long, I would argue agents have undervalued their level of service and end up doing far too much at far too little cost. And actually, there's a level of expertise here. So one argument here from a change and opportunity perspective is that more layers of complexity that are delivered as part of change and reform offers more opportunity for letting agents to really deliver and support peace of mind to landlords. And, that can't be understated when we're facing potential legislation that has impending £5,000 to £30,000 fines. Now, we've just heard from Laura earlier that those fines could be challenged. Now, the government's been pretty clear they don't want to move on those. I think that's fair. They feel proportionate, if not maybe over proportionate. Certainly at £60,000, that would feel slightly over the top, in my view. But the point is, the risk is very real. And of course, the riskiest stage is when any change is implemented, because there's more chance of landlords not being educated than they are. Decent home standard being omitted, I think, Sean, is a crying shame, because I'm not sure there's anyone on this call that wouldn't want to ensure improvements across the entire PRS. And there's been, unfortunately, plenty of examples where within the PRS or indeed social housing, the standard of a home has meant there's been extremely upsetting and horrible outcomes. And that really highlights the seriousness of the role of people providing homes to individuals. It will be interesting to see where we end with this and when that regulation is delivered and what the frameworks are. We had an insight in the white paper, actually, on what that looks like, and then it's gone missing again. So it'd be interesting to see where that goes. It's not the only change, and probably one of the easiest changes for the bill to introduce, Sean, is the change from an assured short-hold tenancy into an assured tenancy. What's your view on this, and what are you hearing from agents and landlords alike? Because that is a relatively simple switchover, isn't it, in relative terms to the rest of the things we've discussed?
It's a Pandora's box, to be honest. It's the one thing that from my observation, it sounds simple, but the one thing from my observation that is actually uniting those groups that represent tenants with those groups that represent landlords and agents, and that is we're not certain about this. We've gone from a situation where you can go into a landlord and say, I want to rent a property for an extended period of time because I've got children, I want to go to the local primary school, etc., etc., etc. And you can sign a fixed term tenancy. So now being, well, actually, I can't by law offer you the certainty that you will want to stay in that property for the period that you want to do so, because I have to, by law, put you on this rolling tenancy. And equally, on the other hand, the landlord's got to say, well, actually, I only want to rent the property out because I'm going to work in Dubai for a year and I want the property back when I get home. Otherwise, I'm going to have nowhere to live. I want to rent it out for a year. Or I'm in the student sector and I know they're doing something now to address that problem. But it still doesn't come down to the fundamentals that fixed term means a fixed term for a lot of people, and it gives them that planning and certainty. So I'm not sure that this has been the wisest idea to implement. They've tried to go down the Scotland route. They say there's been no problems in Scotland. I don't live in Scotland, but what I'm hearing is that it hasn't wrecked the system up there, but it's made it a lot less certain and a lot more insecure. That's my personal view. How it will work, this is why the grounds are so important. And one of the amendments I saw that was put forward by the opposition is basically, it's almost a proposal to say there should be no mandatory grounds. Also, the mandatory grounds that at the moment for getting your property back, for moving back into it or to sell it, they don't want to even to have that as a mandatory ground. Totally at the discretion of a judge. How that would work, I think we are looking at potentially this is more controversial than actually scrapping Section 21. If you scrap Section 21 and kept fixed term tenancies, I think there would have been an easier route forward, personally. But I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to sit down here and have to contest every one of these cases, and all the nuances and the back, the shortcuts and everything else that people are always trying to close off all these loopholes. What I can see at the moment, this has got more loopholes than my granny's crochet, to be honest.
We'll use that quote to promote the podcast, Sean. No, I agree. I fear, though, that Section 21 has had all the airtime, and it's got to be one of these things that's remained in the background. And whilst there's been some joined-up thinking on challenging this, there doesn't seem to be any recognition that this thing is, or this motion is going to get changed in any way above and beyond the student process. So my expectation from everything we've seen, and indeed any amendments that have been suggested, which of course have to go through the due process, is that we should expect to see that process introduced in the way that the bill suggested it would and the white paper suggested it would. So I think that was for all new tenancies initially. And then I think 12, 20 months later, all retrospective tenancies would then be applied. And, that again, we would need to understand what that retrospective action looks like. Is that a change to contract? Is that an addendum? Is it just is? That's the law. I think understanding the actual process that agents and landlords have to go through to recognise that change is going to be really important. And I think there's also question marks here around the legitimacy of guarantors, for example. Under an assured tenancy, you're essentially holding a guarantor liable in perpetuity. And as per my understanding, at least of contract law, which is very limited, so it might be wrong, you can't do that. You can't say to me, you're liable forever. And we can't give you a definition of what you're liable for. It's forever. Now, how the market deals with that and how we deal with that, it will be interesting. But and that goes all the way from a referencing perspective, all the way through to your position, Laura, of actually executing and supporting landlords in a legal defence if necessary. So I think there still is some question marks over that, and understanding exactly how it's implemented will be important. Victoria, good morning to you. You ask, how would this affect the rent review process? So far, the rent review process has been noted. Actually, there's been some quite a bit of debate and discussion around this, hasn't it, Laura? And this centralises around it's not the introduction, because Section 13 exists already. It's kind of the doubling down of the Section 13 process, right?
Yeah. So basically, it's a really good question. Thank you, Victoria. Essentially, it's changing quite a lot. No more contractual rent increases. The only way a landlord is going to be able to increase the rent is using the Section 13 procedure, and that will be able to be done yearly. And if there's dispute between the landlord and tenant as to the rent, and just note there, the rent is to be the market rent. And I think that is quite an important point that's sort of gone under the radar as well. The legislation is clear. The rent is to be the market rent, not just what the landlord wants the rent to be. It's the market rent. And if it's disputed, it goes to the first tier property tribunal, which is a sort of a court. Many of you will be familiar with it, with different sorts of things, but it's a tribunal, it's a court. And the judges in that tribunal will determine the rent as between the landlord and tenant, and then they can sort of backdate it to the date of the notice and the Section 13. And from my point of view, one of the most controversial provisions is this, and I don't want to scare anyone. A landlord and tenant who contract on a rent, within the first 6 months, the tenant will still be able to go to the first tier property tribunal and challenge that rent and say to the landlord, oh, that's not the market rent, I don't want to pay it, even though they've just contracted for it. And the FTT will have the power, first tier tribunal will have the power to change the rent within the first 6 months of the tenancy. That's really surprising to me. But yeah, I hope that sort of summarises the rent review process. I could do sort of half an hour on that, but I hope that's a summary.
I think as we get more clarity and we get more certainty, sorry, Sean, as we get more certainty on these things, we will do individual sessions solely on one point, because there's so many different layers to some of these changes. And I think to highlight the risk there, Laura, is absolutely fair. And I think the other point I would note is that, when tenants are looking for support or asking a question, if the recourse they have is simple, it can be unchallenged and there's no cost to it. I'm going to argue that most tenants will take that recourse and they'll go down that road. And that means to me that if at least the first phase of these changes, the first tier tribunal process could be absolutely overwhelmed. And I'm not in the business of scaremongering. I'm not saying it's going to fall over, but I worry about the volumes of cases and the lag effect of those cases. Because, of course, that FTT does have the ability, legislative-wise, of what we understand at the moment, to backdate those changes as well. Now, they can also work both ways. I'd point to Laura's sort of risky part of it. I'd point out that actually the FTT could turn around and say, actually, the £1,000 that the landlords asked for is not market rate. £1,200 is market rate, and that's the amount you should pay. As I understand it, it can work both ways. I think it's probably unlikely, but it can work both ways. So all these changes have quite a lot of layers to them. But Victoria, at the moment, that's exactly what we're seeing. And understanding those changes as it goes through that and how we can prescribe to those, how you can ensure landlords can be as compliant as possible is going to be really, really important. And to your question, Zita, this morning, if a landlord wanted to keep the rent at a lower level, would the FTT still bring it up to market value? Yes, their job, as I understand it, is to dictate the market value rent to that point. So if a landlord was below that threshold, arguably, yes, the FTT could turn around and say that amount isn't in line with market value. I think going back to the point around assured tenancies and to this point as well, there's a risk here, I suppose, Sean, that it lacks a bit of common sense, where you've got a tenant saying, I would like a fixed term for 12 months, please, because I've got to apply for this school. And you've got a landlord saying, I want a fixed term for 12 months as well. That is just not going to be possible under the new framework, right? Which I think some find quite bemusing to your initial point of it, this being challenged.
Well, I think just going back on a point, I was intervening because you picked up on it very, very quickly afterwards, which is going to be about the pressures onto the first tier tribunal. And as I said, I was in a meeting yesterday talking to the leading judge of the tribunal. The government started off with the premise that the changes to Section 13 rules would mean an additional 1,600 cases per year, in addition to what's already going through the tribunals at the moment. To which the jaw of this eminent judge dropped and said, "You're way off." She's managed to get them to think about 20,000 additional cases. But how long is a piece of string? Once this gets out there, and this is the only way, basically there will be a new industry of lawyers that going around saying, is your landlord trying to raise your rents? Here's how to challenge it. For a small fee, we can take you through the tribunal process. It's going to happen. It's going to be another cottage industry added into what is already a system which is creaking at the seams. So, but going back to you're absolutely right on the tenancies, it's not going to suit all landlords, and that's going to be the problem. Now, we can't make law around hard cases, but when your contingent minorities are significant, like students or retirement home people or young families wanting to move into more sustainable, longer term renting, which is now part of the infrastructure of our society. There will be people who will go through their entire lives with never owning a property, but still want the security of what is basically a family home. It hasn't been thought through, in my view.
No, I think that's fair, and maybe that problem isn't achievable to overcome. Maybe there isn't a solution for that, and I think that's the other thing that we're trying to access a perfect end solution to give everybody security and everybody absolute confidence. And I would argue maybe that doesn't exist in a market where you're talking about somebody owning a property, then lending it to somebody else, and then their lives being changeable, especially with the backdrop of economic stress and turmoil too, for both landlords and tenants. And that's the point as well, right? For landlords, the cost of living crisis, inflation, interest rate changes have had real life effects, just as they have had for tenants. So maybe this problem doesn't have a one size fit all solution, Sean.
Never has, and I think the reality is now. I think we have to be very pragmatic, but not over pessimistic, even optimistic. Look, the industry's faced tsunamis and disasters before, and there hasn't been a mass extinction of the sector. In fact, it's grown. So, for example, when the Tenant Fees Act came through, everybody was predicting that was going to be the end of the agent market, and thousands and thousands of branches would close down, and it would be an absolute disaster. Yes, there was a lot of impact on that. It's still having an impact. However, the market's been resilient. It's bounced back, and it's thriving. I mean, if you look at the number of people that's still joining my scheme, I don't know where they're coming. There's no shyness to come and become a letting agent in this market at the present moment. They're coming in, they're joining the schemes, and they're setting up businesses. That's because the market is resilient. They are thinking of new and innovative ways of dealing with the market. They are starting to think, well, actually, the traditional way of doing things isn't necessarily the way that I'm going to have to run my business ongoing. And that's coming from a driver of a new generation of agent that's coming in, the under 30s, or under 40s and under 30s. It's amazing. You now go to these events and you see how many young professional letting agents there actually are. I suppose we all started as being young, so we were those people.
Now, hey, speak for yourself, Sean. I mean, goodness me.
No, I've always looked like this. Yeah.
I think it's a great point. And listen, that's one of the benefits of being in a free market. Free markets often do take care of themselves, whether we like it or not. They find a way to meander around challenge and change. And I think landlords and letting agents alike are central to that overcoming that challenge. I want to cover a few questions before we move into the final sort of 5 minutes of the webinar, if I can. Somebody who's not left their name, but good morning to you nonetheless, asked, how is the tribunal going to establish what the market rent is? I'm not sure we've fully understood the barometer that they would use yet, right, Sean or Laura? I don't think that's been clarified as to what data source or point they would use in order to establish that. One would argue it can't be the ONS because that's lag data.
No, I think what one sort of tip there for landlords that I've been sort of giving out is perhaps when you're setting your rent, have 3 or 4 examples of what you say the market rent is. Sort of at the time attached to the tenancy agreement, so you're already setting out what you say the market rent is to try and prevent any challenge. The market rent is what the market rent is. It's hard, that's not set. It's not a sort of imposed rent or a capped rent. It is what it is. So it will be interesting. I've seen reference in the questions to whether it's going to be sort of be on a square footage. I'm not sure if it will. I think it will be more property based. The tribunal will, I don't know, look at, in this area, flats of 3 beds are going for this figure. In this area with these parameters, a 4-bedroom house is going for this amount.
It's going to be a dangerous game to play because you could have exactly the same square footage, you could have exactly the same bedrooms, but you could have just spent £20,000 on it, and it'd be the best damn property in the 4-mile radius. And there's going to be so many nuances to this that are going to have to be worked out and either understood or taken as written. And one of the arguments there, if we're not careful, is that it actually results in landlords investing less in their property because hey, it doesn't really matter. Which is against the exact way you've followed my lead there. It's against the decent home standard. It doesn't create a better environment for the tenants, and guess what? All of this ends up being counterproductive. But I'm going to move on. Maria says, "Great meeting, thank you very much, and good morning to you. Would it be possible to have a recording of this, please?" It is indeed. We're going to send a recording post-meeting out to all attendees and sign-ups. Sahim points out that the FTT will never be a success in challenging rents. There is no method or structure to determine market rents. I think you're agreeing with our points somewhat there, or indeed understanding the challenge that faces the FTT. Hugh says, has not been thought through, seems to be a theme of everything I've heard so far about this entire bill. No plan, no depth. Hugh, I think it's fair to say there is elements here that have not been thought through its entirety, although I see it as our job collectively to try and challenge and inform decision makers the best we possibly can and try and shape the bill as much as we possibly can. And I think, if you look at where this was to where it is now, it's clear that the government has been listening to the concern of landlords. I think at one stage it felt like this was an anti-landlord bill. I think it's fair to say that there has been improvements there. So I'm hoping for more depth, hoping for more plan, and hoping for more thinking. I just want to move on past this slide, please. We've talked about some of the political influences here, and I'm conscious we're running out of time. When Labour, if Labour come in, Freudian slip there, if they will come in, they have committed to certain measures in the first 100 days. There's been interesting interviews across different stakeholders within that party that have said within the first 100 days they're looking to abolish Section 21 and introduce reform in the PRS. If this is challenging for the Conservative government, it's challenging for the Labour government. The challenges remain the same no matter which party is in place. And we hope that from a stakeholder point of view, they continue to communicate and really work with the sector rather than sort of moving forward on maybe potential clickbait things that sound great but in practice don't work. And we've covered a few of those today. I just want to finish on how agents can take advantage of these changes, because we've talked, Laura and Sean, about how education helps here. If you're a letting agent today, from everything we hear, is that new business is hard to come by. Landlords are really worried about change. They're really worried about their long-term investment. And as much as interest rates have risen, the cost of living affects landlords. Laura, I'll start with you. What do you see the role of the letting agent over the next 2 to 3 years, given the gravity of changes and also the uncertainty in nearly everything we've spoken about today?
Good question. The role of the letting agent is, in my view, I speak from the legal perspective when it goes wrong, right? Learn, attend this sort of webinar. I'm not vested in Goodlord. I'm a separate practitioner, but learn and be part of the discussion on what this law looks like and is going to be. And then how can you pigeon yourself? How can you place yourself as the best in the business or be aiming towards that? What can you be doing and giving to your landlords? Can you be dealing with the property portal? What can you do with rent deposit passports? I know we haven't got that. What can you do with referencing to make sure that your landlords get the best tenants that stay? Because that's what really people tend to want. People want a good landlord and a good tenant, and the relationship continues for a long time. No evictions, no drama. So what is the referencing process going to be like? What is the market rent? Be absolutely on top of the market rent in that area and have evidence ready to provide. I think the letting agent has a huge role to play. What policies can be put in place? Come and speak to some lawyers to find out what sort of procedures you need to put in place. What tick lists do you have to make sure you're covering everything off on this new legislation? That's just a few thoughts off the top of my head.
Fantastic. And Sean, from your perspective, remaining compliant, what are the best ways to keep up to date, above and beyond maybe webinars like this, as we move forward with proposed changes, to ensure that agents can educate landlords in the best possible way?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. The best way to future-proof yourself is to be constantly learning. So that would be listening to these sort of webinars. Consider joining Property Market or Ucala or Safe Agent, one of those organisations that you have access then to that collective knowledge that is there. Whatever keep up to date with everything with your CPD and your development. I think, however, you've also got to remember you're running businesses. And the first thing I would say to agents is hold your line. So the first thing you shouldn't do, the thing you shouldn't do in reaction to all of this is to start dropping your prices and trying to compete by being the lowest price on the market to try and attract the landlord. Get there, make sure that every one of your landlords understands exactly your value and why you charge what you charge and what the risks are and the benefits are of them not of doing this there themselves. I mean, the number one thing there is a number of agents that want to go it alone now because they think they're saving money. They are they're actually going to be your primary customer, because they're the ones that when it goes pear-shaped, they come and say, "Oh, I wish I had used an agent in the first place." You've got to be there for them, for those sort of people, but also say to your existing landlords, you have to pay us to do the service that it is, but these are the repercussions. They're talking about some silly size fines now for landlords that don't like this. Silly £60,000, to unlimited. and actually losing your property easier than you do at the moment. You could end up kind of like losing your entire property if you break some of these regulations.
Yeah, so, I agree on that. I think if the landlords are in a car race, the track in front of them is changing, and they don't know which way it's going to change to at the moment. And I would, for that point, probably for a quite poor analogy, I would argue that the letting agent role has never been so important to give some peace of mind and assurity and confidence. And why do people go and use a letting agent? When only half the sector do, they're really looking for peace of mind. They want somebody to take care of this and maintain the integrity of their investment. And I think, being able to signpost without scaremonger what these impending changes are, and then reassure that it's probably never been so important to have your property managed by a professional and be able to show why you are a professional and the value you bring, I think then allows you to dictate a fee that it's in line with that value that is being brought to the landlord. So I think it's an opportunistic time for the right agents who can really maneuver and explain and tell that story, because it's a story that's unfolding in front of our eyes. And I'm just conscious we've got a few questions here, so I'm going to cover these really quickly if I can. We've got one from someone who's not left their name. Good morning. How can a letting agent be part of the discussions? It feels as though we do not have a voice. I'm certainly not looking to take your voice away from you. We did have a letting agent on the last session. I'm more than happy to entertain any letting agents that would like to join these sessions. So if you're interested to join these sessions and be part of this and give your voice as part of the panel.
It might have been that you meant voice in this legislation going through. It might have been in response to what I was saying. And
maybe. Either way, if you want a voice on here, you're more than welcome. We have had agents on in the past. If you want a voice in terms of the discussions around the wider bill, then I would suggest speaking to your local MP. I'd suggest speaking to your any trade body you're affiliated with, or indeed look for group support. Open letters are powerful things, and actually joining as a group of people to voice an opinion that you're aligned on can be effective, and we've seen that work in the past. Hugh says, you're doing a very good job, and I find your sessions very informative. I made you in a bad mood. Don't worry, Hugh. Hugh was the point who made the point of no plan and no thinking. It's absolutely understandable. It's been a long year, Hugh. Pascal, incredibly interesting session. Great to hear from Laura for the first time. Thank you. I would echo those thoughts. And finally, we'll finish on Gavin. Thanks, Ollie, Lauren, Sean. Very useful update and discussion. So, listen, that draws us to the end of the session today. Apologies, we've overrun by a few minutes. Hopefully, you found that insightful as an update of where we are and some of the potential talk tracks that we can be using with landlords to help establish why there's an opportunity here to ensure letting agents remain absolutely valuable, as I believe they are. Laura, thank you so much for your insight. I look forward to you hopefully having again in the future as we get more legal updates through the amendment process. And Sean, as always, thanks once again for your insights. To everyone else, have a fantastic rest of your day, and thank you so much for joining. Cheers now. Bye-bye.